Oh, it seems we have attendees joining. Sonia, it seems we have attendees joining. I'm going to turn off my camera.
Greetings to everybody who's joining. We'll get started in just a minute or so. We'll give folks another minute or so to assemble. Okay, good day to everyone. It is just past the top of the hour. A very good day to you all, and welcome to this fourth webinar in the series, Sustainable Finance Talks, which has been arranged by the Swedish Bankers Association, Finans Denmark, Finans Finland, and Finans Norway, the Nordic Banking Associations. I'm Sonia Gibbs, a Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance at the Institute of International Finance, or IIF, in Washington, D.C. We're absolutely delighted to be here with you today as your host and discussion moderator. Today's webinar is entitled Climate Risks and Financial Stability, which will focus on how the financial sector can address and take action against climate risks. This is really a very timely topic, with so much happening internationally this year. A new set of climate scenarios out from the NGFS, the work of the Basel Committee Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Risks, a new report just out from the EBA, the gearing up of the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group. There's just a tremendous amount going on. So it gives me great pleasure today to be here. And let me go ahead and get our panelists introduced. The format today, we will have a set of keynote remarks followed by a panel discussion. So we are delighted to have three stellar panelists with us today. And first up is a man who wears many hats and needs no introduction, but we're so pleased to be joined by Frank Elderson, who is a member of the ECB's Executive Board, as well as Vice Chair of the Supervisory Board. Frank is also co-chair of the Basel Committee Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Risks, along with Kevin Styro of the US Fed. And in addition to all of this, Frank remains the chair of the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS. And we're grateful to you, Frank, for taking the time to be with us today. Frank will deliver opening keynote remarks, after which we'll have a short Q&A session. He'll also stay on for that discussion. Our second speaker is François-Louis Michaud, who is Executive Director of the European Banking Authority, or EBA. The EBA is, of course, very much in the spotlight at the moment, given their new report on management and supervision of ESG risks. François has had a very distinguished career, including at the ECB, with responsibilities in the Single Supervisory Mechanism, as well as the French Supervisory Authority, APCR, and the BIS and the Banque de France. And our third speaker today is Johan Torgby, who will be very well known to all of you in his capacity as chair of the Swedish Bankers Association and as president and group CEO of SEB. Johan also sits on the IIF board of directors. And in fact, our board met just yesterday with a very robust discussion around climate risk issues. He's also on the board of the European Banking Federation, has had a very long career in banking and financial services, and so very well placed to add some private sector perspective to this discussion. So with that, let me give the floor to Frank Elderson for his remarks. And as a reminder, please feel free to tee up questions as we go along using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and it's a great pleasure to see you once more on the screen. Many thanks also to the Nordic Banking Associations for the opportunity to kick off this seminar. Or this webinar, I should say, which I understand will be the final one of a very successful series that was held over this spring. And I would add, rightfully so, with the topic of the talks being sustainability. The challenge of climate change is daunting, and this is certainly true for the consequences of if climate change continues unabated, something that the Nordics are experiencing at first hand as changes to their vast nature and wildlife are becoming increasingly apparent. Actually, yesterday I learned a new word. It's called ice quake in Canada. Just as a reminder of what is going on. And it is also true for the transformation necessary to avoid these dire consequences. The OECD estimates that global investments of US dollar 6.9 trillion every year are required until 2030. And this is just to keep us on track to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Investment will need to be considerably higher if we are to live up to our commitment under the Paris Agreement of limiting the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees. And to put the number into perspective, we are talking somewhere around 8% of global GDP each year. Europe's financial system is largely bank-based, so banks are playing a pivotal role in greening the economy. Today, I will discuss the role that supervisors play in this process. Supervisors aim to ensure the safety and soundness of the banks that we supervise. Climate change creates material risks for banks, so it is our job to ensure that banks, under our supervision, address these risks adequately and proactively. With a strong conviction that central banks and supervisors not only can, but must consider climate-related and environmental risks to fulfill their mandates, many of them have joined forces in the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. The NGFS is a coalition of the willing, as we like to put it, that brings together as we speak, 92 central banks and supervisors from all continents. It is a network that I have been proud to chair since its inception in the end of 2017. And the network is committed to developing climate and environmental risk management in the financial sector and to mobilizing mainstream finance to support the transition to a sustainable economy. The work of the network has been organized in different work streams, focusing on micro-prudential policy and supervision, macro financial consequences of climate change, green finance, and ways to bridge remaining data gaps, and others, actually, other work streams. The NGFS work stream on micro-prudential policy and regulation is now performing in-depth analysis of existing supervisory practices on climate-related and environmental risks. Results of the analysis are expected to be published in the third quarter of this year. And from the work that the NGFS has already done, we have learned that under its membership, initiatives are underway in several jurisdictions to set supervisory expectations, typically covering 5 areas: governance, strategy, risk management, scenario analysis and stress testing, and disclosure. Generally, we have not seen so far new legally binding requirements being instituted. And instead, supervisors issued a clarification of how existing legal requirements may be applied in the context of climate-related and environmental risks. And these will serve the purpose of guiding the supervisory dialogue on climate-related and environmental risks going forward. It should be recognized that both supervisors and financial institutions are in the early stages of a journey towards sound management of climate-related and even more so environmental risks. Therefore, it is to be expected that guidance will be refined over time as expertise and regulation develop and capabilities improve. However, setting expectations is an important step, given the need to urgently start integrating climate-related and environmental risks in financial institutions' decision-making and risk management processes. The ECB is among the central banks and supervisors that has identified climate-related and environmental risk as a key risk factor for the European banking system. The latest edition of our Financial Stability Review suggests that around 80% of euro area banks are already exposed to climate-related physical risks. In November of last year, ECB Banking Supervision published a guide on climate-related and environmental risks. And in that guide, we make it clear that we expect banks to take a comprehensive, strategic, and forward-looking approach to disclosing and managing all climate-related and environmental risks, which also include, for example, the risks of biodiversity loss and pollution. We then asked banks to conduct a self-assessment relating to the expectations that we had set out in our guide, and to draw up action plans for how they intend to comply with them. This supervisory exercise has begun with taking stock of banks' self-assessments. And we are now in the process of benchmarking the bank self-assessments and action plans, and will then challenge them as part of our ongoing supervisory dialogue. This supervisory exercise will also offer banks a strong incentive to bolster their ability to identify and quantify their exposures to climate risks and their tolerance to these risks. And to give you a sense of the magnitude of this exercise, we will be reviewing plans covering 24 trillion euro of banking assets. So let me now discuss more specifically the preliminary picture that has emerged from the bank's self-assessments and their dealings with climate-related and environmental risks. And regrettably, and I would have liked to say differently, but this is what it comes out. The initial picture is not great. All in all, the great majority of European banks are not even close to where they should be. 90% of reported practices are deemed by the banks themselves only partially or not at all aligned with the ECB supervisory expectations. More than half have no approach for assessing the impact of climate risks. And this finding is made all the more striking by the fact that of the 20% of the banks that do have a systemic way of assessing the climate risks, almost all find that climate risks are already having or are about to have a material impact on their risk profile. On top of this, only around 40% of banks have assigned explicit responsibility for managing climate-related risks to the management body. And of those, 3 in 4 do not report on climate risks to management. Banks often claim that their lack of progress in incorporating climate risks into their climate risk management frameworks is due to the lack of available data on climate issues. But in reality, few banks have made any effort at all to take stock of what kind of data they would actually need to start accounting for climate risks. For now, banks can start relying on the wide array of quantitative and qualitative risk management instruments that are already at their disposal. They can also use these tools to design strategies that concretely measure their present and potential exposures to climate risks. But most banks tell us they are not using publicly available data or data from third-party providers to measure climate-related and environmental risks. The ECB expects all banks to harness the fresh information that is available on climate risks and to start assessing the materiality of the climate risks that they are facing. This is the key focus of our supervisory assessment, but it is not our only focus. We will also be monitoring banks' entire risk management framework and how their structures are allowing them to more actively manage and disclose climate-related and environmental risks. But there is also good news. I don't only want to be gloomy. I'm looking at Sonia and she's looking very, very depressed here. So there's also good news. First, almost all banks have developed implementation plans, and many have started to progressively improve their practices. Roughly half of them have started to integrate climate risks into their client due diligence. They have developed dedicated client questionnaires to better understand the climate risks to which they are exposed. And they use this information when deciding to whom they grant credit. In addition, roughly half of the banks are now integrating climate risks into their lending policies, sometimes requiring that a specialized climate-related risk function advises them on the higher risk transactions. What is remarkable is that the progress that we are seeing on all these fronts was identified in banks from different countries with different business models and different asset volumes. Some banks have also been proactively trying to overcome the scarcity of climate-related data by independently developing their own indicators, such as financed carbon emissions, financed technology mix, and energy performance certificates, to identify corporate clients with high sensitivity to climate transition risks. And they have then set limits at portfolio level to manage those risks. And one bank has developed a climate risk dashboard to present to its board's risk committee on a quarterly basis. And this shows that already now, data scarcity can be overcome. Finally, some banks have already started to identify and manage other environmental risks beyond climate, such as those associated with biodiversity loss and pollution. For instance, one bank has started to develop a methodology to measure the biodiversity footprint of its investment and lending portfolios, while others have developed a dedicated group policy regarding their commitments and lending criteria related to biodiversity risks. In our guide, we recognize that other environmental factors related to the loss of ecosystem services, such as water stress, biodiversity loss, and resource scarcity, have also been shown to drive financial risks. And we therefore expect banks to evaluate all environmental risk-related information beyond climate risks to ensure that their risk profile is sufficiently covered against them. These practices are proof that what the ECB is asking is not unreasonable or impossible. Some banks have effectively raised the bar, and those lagging behind should take inspiration from them and follow suit. So what's next? It is clear that banks are still in the early stages of incorporating climate-related and environmental risks in their risk frameworks. Risk identification and risk limits around climate-related goals do not yet actually feature in their risk management processes, and this needs to change. European banks need to drastically improve their capacity to manage climate-related and environmental risks and start acknowledging how these risks can drive others, including credit, market, operational, and liquidity risks. Crucially, we have no need to await regulatory developments before formulating our expectations for the management of climate-related risks. They are firmly grounded on actual requirements and stem from the simple fact that climate-related risks are on the rise and need to be tackled seriously by the whole financial sector. That being said, it is also very welcome that regulators and legislators are not sitting idly by. Earlier this week, you will have seen the European Banking Authority launched a public consultation on its amended guidelines for the supervisory review and evaluation process, which for the first time includes references to ESG and climate risks. And last week, the EBA published an important report on management and supervision of ESG risks for banks that will be input for future supervisory expectations, EBA guidelines, and the review of the legislative framework. At the global level, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has established a task force in early 2020 to undertake work on climate-related financial risks. And this task force aims to explore effective actions to mitigate risks arising from climate change to banking institutions and to the banking system. Recently, the task force concluded that climate-related risks can be captured in risk categories that are already used by financial institutions and reflected in the Basel framework. For example, credit risk, market risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk. And this is a key insight, which saves us from inventing all kinds of new risk categories. The existing ones will do. Building off this analytical work, the task force will now investigate the extent to which climate-related risks can be addressed within the existing Basel framework, identify potential gaps in the current framework, and consider possible measures to address any of these gaps. This important work at the European and the global regulatory level supports and solidifies the ECB's efforts to ensure that banks manage climate-related and environmental risks. Gradually, we need to start treating climate-related and environmental risks as any other material risk. So, with a reflection on all relevant supervisory requirements, we will treat them with the same rigor, toughness, and importance as we treat other material risks. And we expect banks to do the same. Urgent action, and here I will stop, urgent action is not an option, it is an imperative. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you very much, Frank. That was really stirring, something of a call to arms, as it were. You touched on so many key points, you know, the immense need to scale up sustainable finance and ECB banking supervision, the climate stress test, the Basel Committee assessment of information gaps, the new NGFS climate scenarios, and of course our central topic of how we can best address climate risk beyond climate as well. So with that, I want to note that the floor is open for questions. We do have a few coming in. One very practical one, will the results of the bank stress test be made publicly available on the ECB website?
I think that the ongoing bottom-up climate risk stress test that we are doing, which is a macro stress test, the results will be published. The exact granularity, I think, is still being debated. But you know, in the coming months, we will be coming out with that with the results. Maybe, you know, it is of interest if I said a little bit about, you know, some of the preliminary findings that we are seeing there, and maybe some of the lessons learned from this exercise. I think, you know, the first thing that we have learned is that you really need to take a long time horizon to get this right. So we've been using 30 years, and I think this is like a minimum to capture the trade-offs between transition and physical risk related to costs. And then a second of the third lessons that I would like to mention maybe is that, you know, you need new models with respect to the traditional ones that assess credit and market risks. You know, transition channels of climate risk to corporates and banks are not, you know, fully captured in existing frameworks. And so we have developed a novel method. And then maybe the third lesson would be granular information on the counterparts of banks is really essential. You know, climate risks are heterogeneous across sectors, within sectors, across geographical areas. So really, you know, one of the biggest challenges is to collect you know, granular data, and we did that. To just give you, and maybe I'll stop here, but to give you an idea, you know, the exercise that we did encompasses approximately 4 million companies worldwide, 1,600 consolidated banks, and covers, as I said, a period of 30 years in the future. So it's really, I think, you know, a very considerable effort.
Indeed. And another related question, I think, from our audience, from Finance Watch, do you think that we should take the opportunity of the review of the Pillar 1 prudential rules to require sustainability risks to be considered as part of risk assessment?
Well, you know, I'm but a poor supervisor and not, you know, not a legislator. What I've been arguing for many years is that, and I think I said something on that in my introductory remarks as well, is that, you know, banks have been, you know, obliged to manage material risks forever. And we as supervisors are in the business of making sure that banks do so in an adequate manner. So once we started, and when I say we, I mean the entire community, that is the banks and the supervisors, regulators all together, we came to the conclusion that indeed we now understand what the, via which transition channels climate related risks actually transfer into financial risks. And now that we've also seen in this analytical work I refer to in terms of the Basel Committee, that actually they transfer into the standard or the traditional risk categories. One could argue that a lot can already be done, and a lot is already be done. Now, when we get progressively more data, when we are, when in the periods to come, and I know the EBA is doing work on this, individual banks are working on this, that certain risks maybe have been underestimated, certain others are not being seen so well, that there is indeed a risk differential between green and less green, and I'm speaking conditionally here. And it might be that in the end, one would need to also reflect that in the legislation. But in the meantime, we shouldn't wait for that, because, as I said, banks have always been in the business of managing their material risks, and this is no doubt a material risk.
Indeed. Well, I think in the interest of time and seeing no more questions in the Q&A box at this stage, why don't we go ahead and open up for our panel discussion? There'll be plenty more time to bring you difficult questions. So at this point, maybe we could bring Francois and Johan to the virtual stage for the panel discussion. Welcome very much. And just a reminder to all of you to keep the questions coming, and we may include some during the discussion as we go through the questions here. So Francois, let me start with you. Staying with the topic, obviously, of climate risk, perhaps you could tell us about the findings of the new EBA report on management and supervision of ESG risks. The report says that ESG risks should be reflected in a risk-based and proportionate way. And maybe you could elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sonia, and good morning or good afternoon all. And thank you for the opportunity. Very, very nice to be here on such an important topic. This is really great to see also the number of participants to this event this morning. That's really great. I think we, as you know, the European Banking Authority, we do, broadly speaking, 2 or 3 things on this topic. We advise the Commission on their developments of future regulations. Secondly, we also try to bring as much evidence as we can to contribute to this debate. And thirdly, we also try to assess, the first, representations of those risks for the financial system. And we've done a number of things over the past few years, given the mandates we've been given by the European Commission and the co-legislators. But we've done 2 important things in the past few months. And one is the pilot we've run with a number of banks from the European Union, and the second thing is the report you just mentioned. Let me also maybe say a quick word about this climate pilot on risk. I mean, we really want to call that a stress test, because it's not exactly a stress test. It's more like what should serve as the foundation for future risk analysis work. And we worked with 29 banks from 10 jurisdictions, and they represented 50% of the EU banking assets. And the information collected from this exercise is fantastically interesting. And that also helped us fine-tune what we put in the report that you mentioned about management and supervisory practices for banks. If I may just do a quick detour and advertise a bit for this report that we've done and that we published in May. This report shows, and we've tried to look at how easy it is at the moment for banks to identify their exposures to climate-related risks, and we've done that with 2 objectives in mind. First objective is first, of course, to try to steer the discussion in the right direction, but also to steer the discussion about transition in the right direction. So not only for banks to manage their own risk, but also for policymakers to think about what's doable from a transition risk perspective. And I think the outcome is fantastically interesting, because for the circa 30 banks that we had in our sample, more than half of their exposures to non-SME corporates are allocated to sectors that have potentially high transition risk. And if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, also 35% of the banks' total submitted exposures are towards EU obligor with very high greenhouse gas emissions risks. But most interestingly, we also see that it's super difficult at this juncture, and I will spare you the details, for banks to be very specific about the importance of their exposures to climate risk. I mean, they don't have the data. This is the data gap issue that we'll discuss, I think, also in the second part of this discussion. But this is extremely important to understand that banks are in no way in a position at the current juncture to really know in details, the magnitude of their exposures. And that makes our work as regulators, supervisors, or policymakers pretty difficult because, it's very difficult now to know exactly at which speed we can expect banks to move, and at which speed we can expect transition to be organized. So we know more now with this sort of foundational analysis about the known knowns and the known unknowns, and I think that that's the main message here that also inspired our report on the management and supervision of ESG risks. Like Frank was saying before, we've touched on definitions, what should be common definitions for ESG risks, what are the available assessment methodologies that institutions can use to identify, assess, and manage those risks. And thirdly, we also make recommendations on how those ESG risks, and specifically climate risks, should be included in the supervisory review, the SREP process. So we touched and we tried to establish sort of common ground for the work of supervisors and banks on those three areas: definitions, methodologies, and how to translate that in the SREP methodology. But as I was saying before, given the data gap that we're facing at this current juncture, it's really important that banks adopt a risk-based and proportionate approach, meaning that here we have clearly a collective action problem, or a first mover problem. It's really difficult for banks to invest in something where the referential is not agreed yet. So it's really, we're talking about a lot of investments, costly investments for banks, and also potentially for supervisors, as long as the referential is not stabilized enough. So that should be the first priority in our view, that there is some sort of collective move, especially in Europe, towards a situation where we have at least some common categories which are well accepted, some common definitions which are well accepted and commonly used, and that basically the taxonomy that's been developed by the European Union is widely used by the banks. That should be the foundation for any work in this regard. And we believe that it's important that banks concentrate on the parts of their portfolios which are potentially the most affected by climate risk first, and that they don't start to have everything right or everything in a good shape before they start publishing and communicating and risk managing about this situation. So that's a bit what we mean by being risk-based and proportionate. First, let's try moving on with the common definitions and a sort of set of tools that can be used commonly by banks, with no surprises ahead, meaning that they will not invest in something that in a few months will not be relevant anymore. And second, let's try to focus on what we know best without completely ignoring what we don't know so well. Also communicating, that we have uncertainties about that, but we can reduce them over time, taking repeated pictures over time to try and show how we make progress in the assessment of those risks. And that's how we came with the idea, for instance, of publishing a green asset ratio for banks in their disclosure, something that's not supposed to be fantastically accurate when we start, but that over time will improve. So, in other words, the information content of this green asset ratio would be as much quantitative as qualitative. Quantitative for certain parts of their portfolios, that banks know better, and more qualitative for other parts where banks say, okay, we don't know so much, but if we take those estimates and assumptions that we explain in our footnotes, then we are at this level of climate risks, and over time we will see that the repeated pictures are turned into a very fascinating movie that everybody will enjoy, I believe. So that's a bit the approach we are trying to foster at the EB at the current juncture, with our different products, and that we should read, as a whole, this climate exercise and also the latest risk report, as well as the proposals we made to the Commission recently about the KPIs and things like the green asset ratio that we have recommended.
Well, thank you, Francois. And Frank, Francois described the efforts to shine a light on the known knowns and the known unknowns in this really challenging topic of climate risk assessment. So thinking about the new EBA report, how is the work of the EBA helpful to the ECB in your efforts?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, it's a great pleasure to see you, Francois, here and on the screen. Well, I think it's tremendously helpful. And I applaud François-Louis for his leadership. I remember that when before the first Commission Sustainable Finance Action Plan, there was a high-level expert group of which I was a member. And I remember then when that started, the EBA was not even a member of that because at the time they didn't think this was relevant. But during that, so after some months so this is like 4 years ago, the EBA scratched his head and thought, no, we need to be part of this. And ever since, you've been part of that journey. So I want to celebrate that. And it's, of course, tremendously helpful for us as a supervisor that the EBA and now embraces this, comes out with such a what is it, 166. So whenever you see me looking here, I'm not kind of like wandering away with my thoughts, but I'm looking at your report. So I think that is super, super helpful. Maybe, if you allow me, Sonia, one remark on what you said, François-Louis, in terms of, banks having to grapple with, an imperfect world of imperfect data. That is, of course, true. The point I've tried to make, however, is that if we look at the banks in different jurisdictions, different business models, different sizes, we see good practices across. So it can be done. It's not that it cannot be done. The thing is, though, that it has to be ramped up, and that there are too many that are still lagging behind. Yes, it would be wonderful if all these, all the data were there, if there were, internationally agreed disclosure standards, and that everything was perfect, but it's not. And we just cannot wait because the risks are there already. So yes, of course, as a supervisor, we are very cognizant of the fact that the things are not perfect. Of course, we understand this is a journey, but it's a journey that needs to be walked fast, and inspiration needs, I think, to be drawn from those who already show that even under the present circumstances, you can do much more than maybe something.
Thank you. Well, Johan, you've heard from Frank and from Francois, raising the bar. Patchy data is better than no data. This can be done. How is SEB approaching this challenge of climate risk assessment and reporting? And how do you see climate risk management as part of your overall business strategy?
Well, thank you, Sonia. First, I'll just agree. I agree with those comments, and thank you for inviting me for this formidable duo, and for me to join. It's a true privilege, and good to see you, Sonia, helping us in the Nordics. We typically meet in the IIF in Washington setting, so you're doing a fantastic job hosting these sessions. I think we first need to acknowledge that we all want to manage substantial critical risks in the system, and we need both pull and push, or carrot and stick. Regulators and supervision has an enormously important role here, because I like to start thinking good about everybody, and let's save the planet. We are consuming too much right now for the better good, and we need a little bit of stick. We need everything to mobilize. But there's also a massive opportunity for banks to play this role, rather than being fearful of not being regulatory compliant only, because that's also important, but we can also take a very, very important role to be progressive. So the simple answer to your question is we integrate it everywhere. I think the Nordics are quite progressive. I'll do a few concrete examples on what I mean, because it's too simple to say it like that. About a year ago in SEB, and I think I represent many on this call, we started to think about sustainability to be a parallel to credit risk. We don't need to discuss credit risk in a bank. We're not worried about handling of liquidity risk, credit risk, capital, etc. We've done it forever. It's difficult, but we have some ways to do it. My parallel is that sustainability is of equal magnitude. It affects every single individual in a bank, every single relationship, and hence it needs the same fantastic elevated governance standing in the bank. So what we did in September last year, we created Group Executive Sustainability Committee, just like we have the Group Risk Committee. And just having the CEO, myself, and the whole management team represented, and all of a sudden, wow, what a difference it made. Because now we have regular meetings, and everything from small policy changes on the fossil exposure to the most critical client engagement is now up on the top level, reported to the board. And I think that's a way to say how forceful this is coming to be integrated in everything. You asked about business and business strategy. To me, it's the same thing. It's the biggest opportunity as a banker I've ever seen. So we can start with, you have to divide the risks in this in many different forms. The first one is asset risk. So we have today a notion what an equity is worth, a stock is worth, an asset on the books in our lending portfolio. And we are very worried we are over-exaggerating that value. Stranded asset, maybe we will find ourselves very, very shortly saying to ourselves, how could we think that value was permanent and stable? So this is a very interesting opportunity for a bank. We, of course, in equity analysis, we help institutional clients to find those value attributables to do smart investments. Because right now we're overestimating several asset values because we don't know how to model this non-financial risk and bridge it into what we know so well, financial risks. And that's the task we stand to do right now. Investment management and wealth is, of course, moving this way. We have 80% of our money that we manage on behalf of others. Also, the same thing, we can now use paragraph 8 and 9 to have a common understanding of where do we invest. And I think we're all going to go to 100% of ESG criteria or close to when it comes to the asset management side. Then on investment banking, this is super integrated. We actually in December 18 announced the energy bet, we called it. We will bet that energy advisory will be the future. And we hired 40 investment bankers of a different kind of nature than we used to, who could understand the transition problems much better than the typical financial advisor could. And this has been the best decision we took on in this area. And right now we're expanding that. So this is the role of banks of becoming the client's financial services advisor in the transition. And I can name many, many large industrial companies who have a very big problem ahead of them, finding, not only consultants or regulators or politicians, they're also finding banks to help them out in developing the financial services for the future. Green bonds is the most established ones. It's an explosion right now within the area of product development of financial services. So it's actually a business plan I'm describing to you now, but it's 100% dedicated to help the planet to become fossil free in one way or form. And my last point is the way you also integrate in the daily life is, of course, all the collaborative approaches one is engaging on. So all the principles for responsible banking, principles for responsible investment, Poseidon on shipping, this forum, we are part in the expert group in the EU, etc., taxonomy. And I think these are super helpful to get a common understanding for what is what. On this point, why it's so important is this is a microeconomic problem. We cannot use only macroeconomic data in order to get to the problem. In the end, we're going to have an exposure to a utility where 50 banks in Europe might or might not want to engage. And we need to agree how green or not is this in the GAR ratio, in the Brown ratio that we calculate, and in the transition ratio, which is our word for the Paris. The people that do harm, we need to help to do less harm. They will never do anything good, but we need to help them do less harm. And these three needs to be communicating with each other: brown, green, and transition.
Thank you. Now, that's a really clear perspective, and I think I'd have to agree from an international perspective, looking across the many banking sectors around the world, this is certainly on the progressive end of things. I thought it might be helpful at this point to offer a little peer analysis, as it were, on the climate risk issue. So I wanted to share with all of you just a couple of takeaways from a forthcoming IIF climate scenario stock take that we've been doing. We've been working with 20 global banks from around the world. and consulted with our wider membership. And we find that about 85% of global banks are already engaged in or preparing for specific supervisory exercises. And about a third of this group has been using the first edition of the NGFS reference scenarios. And just to give a sense of what the group values in supervisory climate risk management exercises is early and open engagement, standardized templates, clear expectations, access to data and tools, including third-party methodologies, and peer insights, so the ability to compare their results with each other. So webinars and discussions like this one are tremendously important here. And Frank, you won't be surprised to hear that the most challenging area for the banks that we're working with remains the lack of necessary data. And this does vary across different types of risks and exposures, but it was a pretty universal statement. So much progress needed. Okay, so I want to turn back to Francois here to continue the discussion around climate risk and the capital framework as well. And clearly there are many, many ways, Francois, for supervisors to look at climate risk, and the EBA has consulted on new metrics to assess banks' alignment with a low carbon economy, including a green asset ratio, as you mentioned earlier. So what kind of feedback have you had on this proposal, both benefits, but also maybe potential challenges?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this very important question. Indeed, we collected a lot of feedback, and some positive, some not so enthusiastic about it, because as we know, I mean, and I certainly agree with Frank that there is a lot that can be done in this area, but there are also a number of challenges that banks are facing to get the data right. And just to give you an example from the pilot exercise that we've carried out and published in May, for the same exposures, sometimes banks were not treating that in the same way using their current internal methodologies. So that's the problem we are facing, and that's why I was saying that it's high time that collectively we stabilize the referential we use. Otherwise, I mean, banks might make tremendous efforts, and that might be very relevant for their own idiosyncratic situation, but from a collective approach perspective and from a systemic stability perspective, then we'll have hard time to draw serious, well-founded conclusions. And that's the issue we are collectively facing with all types of stress test exercises at this juncture. I mean, we need the grounds, you know, the adequate sort of minimum understanding on the concepts we use or that banks use to be able to compare situations across the board. So that's but we believe that it's important to move indeed. And again, I mean, like Frank was saying before, we are completely, I mean, persuaded that banks are in a position to say much more and to drive the change much more actively. And many of the banks are doing it, but not all the banks. We're talking about a large banking system in Europe. And we see different types of players here. Some are large and very sophisticated and well advanced in this process. They've started investing in this area a long time ago, maybe even before the 4 years ago that you were referring to. And others are more a bit in a wait-and-see mode because they want to see in which direction this will develop and what kind of concepts they should use, what are the expectations. So there's a thirst for you know, guidance in this space at the moment, and I think we are all of us trying to contribute to that with the you know different documents we publish in our different roles. But that needs to converge, and I think this is really you know the key topic we want to support, the key discussion we want to support. So on the feedback, the stakeholders, we heard from many stakeholders that there is a bit of a tension between moving in Europe versus moving what might come from other jurisdictions outside Europe. So that's the first type of feedback we've received, because especially for the largest banks operating in multiple jurisdictions, again, they need something that's sufficiently consistent across jurisdictions. The second feedback we received, to make it simple, is that we are asking them for stuff which is pretty granular compared to the underlying information that they can obtain from their customers, You know, I mean, of course, everybody has to comply at some point with the EU taxonomy regulation, meaning I'm talking about the real sector here, not the financial sector, but we are not there yet. I mean, so for many corporations, this is early days. And so, I mean, again, I mean, that has an impact on how quickly also banks can, you know, reflect that. So they play a role. So it's a push and pull, you know, dynamic here, but we should also take into account that for a large part of the real economy, this thinking is less advanced than in the financial sector. So that's a second important feedback that we got. Then there were also a number of things about, you know, the timing, you know, when should be the first reference date for Pillar 3 disclosure. We recommended you know, that the reference date would be December 2022 and disclosures in Q1 2023. So very much in the direction that Frank was suggesting, that let's move fast. But that also you know, triggered a certain dose of skepticism from the banks. And then I'd say the frequency was also mentioned. And then there are also topics around the complexity and the granularity. You know, should we include, for instance, prudential parameters such as PD, stage 2, non-performing or performing status in the disclosure itself, and so on and so forth. So if I try to wrap up, because that's also the main thrust of my number of discussions I've had with banks directly in the past few months. There is an overarching concern with regard to disclosure at this current juncture, that what you disclose, you are accountable for what you disclose. So I mean, this has consequences. This is not something you want to do lightly, you know, because that's certified information in a sense. So we see a certain nervosity from a number of banks about what exactly would be in this disclosure that they would have to stand by, you know, ultimately. So our response to this is that don't be afraid. I think it's also in your interest to be seen as part of the solution rather than being part of the problem. So you need to demonstrate your willingness to disclose as much as possible. Then the word possible is important here. And that's where I think we need to differentiate between what would be really, you know, very specific in the disclosure and what would be surrounded with footnotes and, you know, comments in the disclosure. I think this part about, you know, the known knowns and the known unknowns, again, sorry for the analogy, but is really important, I think, because that would help the investors to understand, you know, the sort of challenges that banks are also facing if they come clean and clear about that. Saying nothing about their challenges is a losing strategy from my perspective. They should say what's difficult for them to know and to assess at the current juncture, as well as what they can assess adequately at the current juncture. If they do both and make progress on both fronts, I think they are all in a better place. Otherwise, they might face a situation where the goalposts are moving because certain types of investors would be asking more and more and more, and certain types of players might be also disclosing, or not disclosing, but communicating in their roadshows, in their financial communication more and more, but not on a serious ground, because that's not certified, that's not disclosure. So you see the sort of dynamic here, and why we believe it's important to keep moving on both fronts, what we can speak about with a sort of good level of certainty, and also the challenges we are facing, and still the efforts we are making to overcome those challenges.
It's an interesting point you make about the disclosure and the responsibility. I think in a US context, that's often seen as liability, right? If you disclose, then you may leave yourself open to liability if your disclosures are not perfect. But Frank, let me turn back.
In the US, if I may.
Please.
No, I mean, I'm not just saying it's not only in the US. I mean, you are, of course, liable for what you publish, you know, in your disclosure, you know, everywhere.
Of course. Frank, I have a question for you around how the ECB looks at quantitative capital requirements. However, I get the sense from the questions from the audience that they'd like some broader focus as well. And I wanted to ask this question to you because I know in a Dutch context, this comes up quite a bit. And the question is, many building complexes under planning or construction at the shoreline in old harbor areas, for example, you know, some of these have been in use for more than 100 years. How might they be affected by sea level rise? And do we have some good information about how that those risks are evolving.
Thank you. I will try to answer those questions, but first I want to compliment Johan, because I really like his intervention, and I want to say that, I've always been hoping, but first before joining the ECB, I joined, I was at the Dutch Central Bank, and the abbreviation is DNB in Dutch, DNB. So I would always say, banks should move into sustainability, not because DNB tells them to do so, but because it comes from their DNA. And the difference is, of course, that if your supervisor tells you and you do it grudgingly, then the supervisor goes away and looking at other banks and then you stop doing it, or not, your heart is not in it. But it was so clear that your heart is in it, and that is needed, because if it needs to be tone at the top, and it needs to be action at the top, not just the tone. You need to live it, and then suddenly it will permeate through the entire organization, and you will start reaping also the benefits of the the other side of the coin of what the risk management is. And because when I don't need to tell you or the audience that if there's a risk, there's also a way to make money out of that, and that is what banks do, isn't it? So I was really inspired by the way you talked about this, and I really wanted to say that very, very explicitly. That's one. On the capital point that you make, of course, a capital question, Sonia. This is a journey. So what we have been saying so far is that what we will be doing in this year's SREP, and same kind of like with the bottom up micro stress test that we are planning for next year, is that this first round, we are not foreseeing any direct capital requirements. We cannot exclude that in some cases there might be indirect effects via the scoring methodology. But looking more into the medium term, I would certainly not do that, because as I said, we need to move towards a world in which we treat risks as we have always treated them, and that is that they need to be adequately capitalized, and these are material risks, as I said before.
And Frank,
the question on the sea level rise. Well, the Dutch are pretty good at this, so I think that they will be able to build some more dikes for the time being. But this is of course an issue, and I happen to know that, for example, Miami, where you have this problem as well. It is no longer enough to look and think, okay, I know I have my data as granular as Miami versus Atlanta, or within Miami, certain areas. No, you have to go to zip code. And if you go to zip code, you have to look at what side of the street, because it might just be the difference between 6 feet higher or lower. And that kind of granularity is the kind of data that banks need. And that is increasingly available, actually.
Johan, I think we have heard from Frank and from Francois quite a bit. You are going to have the last word with private sector perspective here. Two things. One is how you're looking at green supporting, brown penalizing factors, the capital framework. The other is your net zero targets, very ambitious, net zero banking alliance. How are you going to deliver on those?
First, I'll just say I think it's too much polarization in the whole sustainability debate. So the words like penalizing or supporting, it's not helping me. And this is where I come from. I think anyone who conducts themselves in business which has inherent risks in it needs to take into account what can happen. What if? Capital in the banking world is the way you should reflect as many of the risks as you can. Therefore, I would support to have capital reflect the risks we are talking about, which we not yet know exactly how to quantify, because I feel that we are underestimating the risks and we're not giving the right incentives to do green. Maybe we should take more risks in order to make sure that entrepreneurs within startup community around clean tech gets a little bit more financial markets attention. So that's fine. And in SEB, we don't know how to do it. I would love to do it through capital, because I think it's the way to incorporate the risk aspect and ask our CRO in SEB to use some advanced thinking to reflect it appropriately, but also loosen it. The communication between penalizing and call it supporting, that's not an issue for me. That's about the amount of capital in totality. if you're not worried about the total amount of capital in the banking system, you can play around with them as a zero-sum game to direct the banking industry in the direction it should go. In SEB, we use internal transfer pricing. So we have done this because I know I can stand on a conference like this and talk as much as I want. When I put money on the table and ask them, it's going to cost you double if you want to do another harmful investment, it will be done less. And by the way, I just halved the price if you want to do something which I believe is future-proof. It's future-proof for the bank, for society, and I will do that heavily because it reflects the true thinking, which I cannot model up right now. I don't know how to put it in the DCF or the M&A valuation, but I can say that we need to be brave. The last bit on this is disclosure is very different from doing anything. I completely agree with everything that has been said. Disclosure, taxonomy is fantastic. We will do 3 things in SEB, and maybe I can inspire someone. We will go for 3 measurements: the brown, the green, and the transition. The green, we've decided to go for GAR, so there will be a comparable government-supported way of treating it. We also will do the brown, that is how much harm out of the balance sheet do we have, and we put targets on these. And then the transition, which is the most interesting. We have 17 agencies, government and non-government agencies, helping us with a barrel of oil consistent with Paris. They are widely different in terms of assessments over the next 30, 40 years. So for me as a practitioner, impossible to relate to. I don't know what net zero is, because I always ask, what's the gross numbers? How much oil can you allow in the net zero? Because I need the gross number. And here you can see some are arguing very simplistically, new technology and carbon capture will sort everything else, so we don't need to do anything. And the opposite is net zero equals gross zero. Take it down to 0. And in there, you need to find your way. This is the transition. And I agree on the data comments, but I think people exaggerate data problem because it's an 80-20 rule in corporate and investment banking. 80% of the clients, 20% of the clients represent 80% of the problem. And that's a microeconomic problem. You do bottom up. In an SEB, we're talking about a few hundred of particularly harmful businesses that we can go through bottom up. And there you have, and I like your comment, Francois, don't strive for perfection tomorrow, strive for a significant positive change now. And we'll calibrate the GAR measure as we go along and make sure that we do something rather than having perfection as the bar, because we will get nowhere. And we will just argue all the time about gas, the role of gas in the energy transition or not. And the last one, the transition, is for us to classify every company that we have, every single one, in a scale of 7, where there's the dark green and the dark brown. And that is a judgment, subjective assessment we will do. We've done this for the fossil industry already, where we make a call. We believe this management. We believe the capabilities of this company to transform from doing this amount of hard. Take an automotive company. We've done it for automotive. How credible is the plan to get the tailpipe CO2 emission down by 50% over the next 5 years? If the management team, we know them very well, we were actually one of the green advisors to one of the big automotive companies, we'll give them a yellow and say, this is credible. They're not green, but they are transitioning. And then we'll publicly disclose exactly what's dark green, light green, yellow, orange, brown, and black as a proportion of our balance sheet with an aim. This is the important bit, for it to improve. What we're talking about here is to just get a level playing field to begin with. But the real work is thereafter, because some banks will have a lot of harmful exposure today. But that's a reflection of their history, or maybe geographical location, or the energy strategy of that country where you reside. The change from there should be equal for everybody. And of course, Norway, probably the most renewable energy country in the world, they will have a fantastic starting point. But it doesn't mean that they don't have the same challenges that maybe Middle America, who has a lot of coal still. And if you're a bank in that region, you have a very different type of initial footprint assessment. But the change is the important bit. And these 3 is at least our ambition, and I think many others, to come out with publicly. And this is very much what the Greenpeace is around. The Greenpeace, I call it activist tonality of the bank, is for these 3 to be there. Transparently, you can validate the result, you can show how you got there, and then you can track it going forward. So I think we sort everything. We need it to take wise decisions. We need capital and other things to reflect the actual risks we are having in our businesses. And we need the general population and politicians and everything else to compare and see that who is performing and who's not. because the public opinion is a fantastic energy motivator to do good as well. Thank you.
Speaking of motivation, that was both inspirational and did a great job bringing together all of our themes today. So thank you very much for that. I wish we had another hour or 6, but we have come to the end of our time. Thank you all so much for a terrific discussion. Thanks to the Swedish Bankers Association, all of the Nordic banks for putting together this great webinar series, and thanks to a terrific audience and their great questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you so
Pleasure.
much. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.